These are the highest damage players on the very first boss of Sunken Temple, and more importantly, these are the highest damage warrior players on the very first boss. We don't have time to check out the literal entirety of the top 25, but we can check out these guys who are the top 5 warriors currently. You see, they're all doing around 1200 DPS, and I got some questions about how they're playing. I'm also wondering what their raids are looking like, because that influences how they play and how you could play in relation to them. We're also going to be checking out what the equipment they're using in raid is. You're going to notice that it's nothing too surprising and you can get your hands on it pretty easily. But that's not the only question you're going to have. You're probably also wondering, what abilities do they use? Are these guys getting a little bit lucky with their slam procs? And how hard are their abilities hitting? I wonder, does this line up with what was getting simulated before the phase? And we'll check that near the end of the video. That way you can find out, is your rotation going to give you a certain amount of DPS given your predicted kill times with the players you're playing with? But first, let's make sure to check out their raids before we start thinking about yours. We're going to stack all these parses on top of each other really quick so we can see what their kill times looked like. And you're going to notice that although most of them have around an 80-second kill time, not all of them do. One of them's at nearly 120 seconds, which is pretty interesting. The one that was at 120 seconds was middle of the pack. This one's the number one, and we're going to fade from 1 to 5 so you can see what the damage profiles for all these raids look like. And then I'm going to make them all overlay on each other here so you can see that most of these raid groups have a pretty similar distribution of how the DPS deal damage. If you didn't notice this, replay that last bit, but basically the warriors are on top in most of those groups, and I think it's safe to say that these guys are just trying to progress because if they risk dying, they lose their world buffs on ladder fights, so it's not like they're padding. Here's the gear that all these guys were using. You'll notice that it's pretty similar, and in general, it's not stuff you're going to have too hard of a time getting your hands on. So this should encourage you and make you feel like, wow, you're going to be able to perform really good in your next raid. Let's get on to the actual ability usage. You're going to notice that they're going heavy on heroic strikes, most of them, and they're getting the free slam procs. These guys aren't using too many other rage consuming abilities. I imagine it's they just don't have enough rage generation that they can safely do it. Even with these guys using gladiator stance specs, it's the same deal. They're only using the highest damage per rage move, so that being Sunder, Slam, and Heroic Strike, depending on their spec. But we are noticing that people are going Dual Wield Fury and Glad Stance. Later on in the video, we'll run the sim with these assumptions I have about why they're not using all their moves and check to see how much DPS the sim would predict they would do. That way we can confirm this idea. Here you can see how hard each of their abilities are hitting. Of course, we're going to see Heroic Strike and Melee on top for basically any of them because Melee is always the way you do most of your damage. So I'd pay more attention to the stuff like Devastate on here and Slam, and then how many Whirlwinds there are. Those are the kind of things, along with Overpowers, where you're going to have some more insight into what kind of stuff really makes sense. In my opinion, you're going to notice that these guys are really just using a very tiny setup of spells at the moment. But if they had more rage, I think they'd be using more. Honestly, the thing that surprises me the most is that hamstring spam doesn't appear to be very meta. I imagine that all these guys just DPSing on trash got the opinion that likely they wouldn't use it. Here we're going to look at some timelines so you can see how they sequence their moves with a little more granularity. But as you're going to notice, in general, these guys are really not using all that many moves. I imagine DPSing on the trash, they kind of made their minds up about what they would try on this first boss. You got to remember that all these guys are going to be playing in a slightly risk-averse way because any fuck-ups means that they wouldn't have world buffs on later fights. These are very early kills, and so they're not going to be necessarily playing the way that you should. If you have more buffs than them, which is very possible, and you have better gear than them going into Sunken Temple, which is also very possible, I bet that you can get away with using more rage, and you probably should. That is what the sim says, and I really doubt it's wrong about that. More rage is pretty much always more damage after all, as long as you can find a way to spend it, of course. Now you might also be wondering how these guys time their cooldown usage. They basically are just doing the normal stuff. They're stacking that stuff on the end of the fight, making sure that they get some really good uptime when they're doing executes. They might not all have the exact same usage of their flagellation proccing buffs though, because they're not all expecting execute phase to happen at the exact same time, but most of them had it at the exact same time. And you probably got some other questions about, well, what kind of buffs did they have, and how are we actually sure of anything that didn't pop up very obviously in the logs? For example, things like consumables, you won't always see them in the buff log, but if you die, you do see them. So that's what we got right here. I'm checking that out, making sure that they do have Leader of the Pack and also the elixirs, which some people might be wondering if they had that in Raid. We were able to see that they had these buffs and also that they have the Dark Moon Fair buff, which you'll notice in just a moment, because they have their first wipes later on in the raid. None of these guys had any problems until they got pretty deep into Sunken Temple, even though a lot of them were doing it before any nerfs. But now we can stop looking at the logs and we can start looking at the sim. We can see how good was this thing at actually predicting people's DPS given the rotations they actually used. So let's go into the sim, and what we're going to do is we're going to configure it so that way it has the same buffs as these guys, the same consumes, and the same abilities are being used, and we're going to be able to know how accurate is this thing. You'll notice that I basically clicked off the abilities that dual wield Fury Warriors were not using a whole lot of in this raid, and I clicked on all the stuff that they were using. We also have the fight duration set as 80 to 120 seconds, because as we can see, the fights were either 80 or the long one was about 120 seconds. And the sim ends up telling us that people do about 1200 DPS, which, what do you know, that is exactly what we are seeing in the logs for all of these guys. But what is different than what was in the expected rotations? Really not much. The big thing is that they weren't spamming hamstring as much as we thought they would, but that's probably going to end up being a thing later on. However, this doesn't actually account for all the players that we saw. Only 3 of these 5 players were actually dual-wield Fury. 2 of them were Glad Stance, and so you're probably wondering how good is the sim for them. So let's make sure to check that out too. So now we have a Glad Stance profile loaded up, but we don't have all the settings done correctly, so don't worry, we're not off by 500 DPS. Let's quickly click on these world buffs along with Leader of the Pack and then see where it leads us. We also got to enable Recklessness. Basically, all these guys wrecked on the first boss. And then you can see, yet again, we get a number very close to 1200 DPS, but we're actually missing something. No, it's not any of the runes or talents. We just forgot to put a food item on. So let's quickly click that, sim one more time. It closes the gap just a little bit more. And now we can see that, yes, this sim rocks. Make sure to check out Guybrush's sim if you ever want to discover this kind of information all on your own and not look at YouTubers. It's really fun. It's free. There's a link in the description. He doesn't take any money for it, although he should. It's absolutely fantastic. If you want to check out any more content related to warriors, guild management, dealing with people problems in World of Warcraft, that's what my channel is all about. This is all I have for today, and my name's Jake. Click that video if you think it's interesting to you, and if you don't like the idea of it, then don't click it. Have a good one.